Welcome to Inner West Library and History. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay our deepest respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today's presentation is part of our digital series Women in Gaming, exploring and celebrating the various roles of local women in game development, be it coding and programming, game writing, composing music for games, or graphics and game art. We hope you enjoy learning about these incredible women and are inspired to consider a career in this ever expanding and fascinating realm. Enjoy!
Hi, my name is Dr Samantha Lin and I'm the lead writer of T43 Studios, which is a Sydney-based independent games development studio. I do lots of things in my spare time. I've got lots of hobbies, including writing, playing video games, playing with my new kitten. I love reading and designing graphics, including things like enamel pins and stickers. Basically, I just love anything to do with fandom. So in terms of my professional experience, I have been teaching English literature for over 15 years now. So I have a degree in science and arts, so a bachelor's in science and arts where I majored in psychology, English literature and Japanese. I have a master's in 19th century literature from Durham University in the UK, and I have a PhD from Queen's University Belfast in Shakespeare studies, and particularly Shakespeare and the soundtrack. So you might be wondering, how is it that someone who's spent so much time with stuffy academic things ended up in game writing? Well, funnily enough, I spent most of my childhood playing lots of video games. In particular, I was a huge fan of Pokemon. I'm still a huge fan of Pokemon, and I play Pokemon Go all the time. I'm on, well, level 40 at the moment. I'm very much looking forward to making my way up to the new cap of level 50. So I loved Pokemon as a child. As I grew up and got into my rebellious teenage phase, I started losing interest in just the more childish Pokemon games and wanted more of a better story in my games. And that was when I discovered BioWare's game called Baldur's Gate 2. Now, Baldur's Gate 2, for some of you who may have heard of it, it's a very old school game, or for me, I think it's quite old school. So I started playing it in around, I think it was around 2001. That was when I discovered this thing called role-playing games, so RPGs. And in particular, Baldur's Gate 2 had this amazing plot, had these amazing characters and stories. You could go and do all sorts of things in this creative fantasy world, and there would be consequences. So one of the things that I used to do back in the day was try and enter battles with our allies, and then the whole communities in the game would get really angry at me and they'll start attacking me and my party. So I really enjoyed that aspect. I really enjoyed doing all sorts of things that were not quite, not quite what the developers intended, things with interesting consequences, and I got really interested in playing that game. So I played Baldur's Gate 2 many times throughout my teenage years. It got even more interesting for me when I discovered these things called mods. So back then, when we were back in on dial-up internet, we could download these wonderful game mods where essentially you could actually have different conversations with different characters. Now, in Baldur's Gate 2, we actually had one male character you could romance and 3 female characters you could romance. I discovered these mods, which meant that you could actually romance other characters who weren't in the original game. And I got really interested in that dynamic between the protagonist and these other characters. So that was Baldur's Gate 2. Now let's fast forward a couple of years. So there was another game developed by the same company, BioWare, and it's called Dragon Age. So many of you may have heard of Dragon Age because it's a lot more popular than Baldur's Gate 2. So Dragon Age actually, so as of today, we have three full Dragon Age games that have been published, and a fourth has been announced. I'm quite excited about the fourth one. So one of the best things about the Dragon Age series is you could go and slay demons. They were called Darkspawn in the plot, and have these romantic relationships. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. I could just live out all of my fantasies through this game and develop all these wonderful relationships, maybe kill some dragons while I was at it, but really have these great conversations and great relationships with these characters. And it was at that time that I got thinking with a couple of my friends who are actually both women, both Asian women, in Sydney. And we got together and we were really into Dragon Age at the time. And we thought, hey, how about we create a game that really focused on that development of relationships. We really focus on characters, character interactions and stories, not just the big stories, not the big overarching hero quests of slaying dragons, but the small stories, the gentler, quieter stories of finding the right cup of tea for a friend that you've met, finding a nice gift for a new friend, going over to visit a friend and chatting to them about the latest fashions. Okay? So it was from those conversations that our flagship game, Regency Love, was born. Okay? So as you can see here, oh no, my thing has been locked. Okay? So as you can see here, Regency Love is our flagship game. And from the name itself, you might determine that it is from the Regency period of England. Now, the Regency period, some of you may have heard of the term Regency and you may think, oh, boring, Jane Austen, and oh, having to write essays. Oh yes, that's part of it, but the Regency is also a time that the new Netflix Bridgerton series is set, and some of you may have actually watched it. So it's a great time ranging from 1811 to 1820. And it's a time where lots of people were just wearing pretty dresses and had great conversations and talked about tea a lot and talked about the latest fashions and scandals. For example, if one of your friends went to a ball and danced more than 2 dances with the same gentleman, what a scandal! So we really loved those dynamics that we find in the Regency era and in Regency era stories. And my team and I then decided, okay, let's write a game, let's make a game that is just focused on the Regency period and focused on the characters, the relationships and the stories from the Regency period. And so Regency Love was born. This is a very good question. So game writing, the way I see it, is that it needs to be in relatively shorter snippets than traditional writing. We're looking at, so for traditional writing, I'm thinking of prose fiction. Now, prose fiction, basically we have in the form of novels, novellas, or short stories. With something like prose fiction, so I'll use this as an example. Okay? With something like prose fiction, you just sit down and you just read for all these words, and it's not particularly interactive. For game writing, on the other hand, you want more to be happening than just the story. You want more than just text. Now, I know that there are games out there that are just text-based, but you might have other images that play into the game as well. You might have some sound effects, some music, some visual effects that's on top of the writing. But generally speaking, game writing will have that level of interactivity that you don't get from the traditional writing. By picking up a pen or a laptop and starting to write your game. So obviously there are different types of games out there and different types of stories to be told in games. But essentially, if you have the idea for a game, if you have the idea for a story, now it doesn't have to be anything big. Okay, so something as simple as, for example, you might think, okay, I want to make a game where we want to see if we can train a cat. Okay, train a cat to do all sorts of tricks. As some of you may know, cats aren't very much they're not very easy to motivate and not particularly easy to train in that way. So you might think, okay, so I've got this little cat and I want to make a game where I'm getting this cat to do certain tricks. Now, rather than focusing on just the tricks element of the game, maybe it's about developing relationships with this cat. So maybe the cat will listen to me more, or the cat might be more open to doing tricks if I spend time playing with the cat or feeding the cat or rubbing the cat. Already you have a bit of a story going, right? So all you have to do then is to sit down and write out something. It doesn't have to be great. You can just write out in dot points, some sentences, and then branch them off and say, okay, if you were to give your cat, say, some dry kibbles, would the cat like you a bit more? Would the cat not like you? You give the cat some dry kibbles. Maybe the cat will increase their affection for you by 2. Then you might decide to play with the feather toy. Oh, the cat loves the feather toy, and then their affection for you is increased by 5. Or you might decide to rub the cat's tummy. Or, well, the cat might not like having its tummy rubbed, so you'll get -2 in the affection. So you sit down and you write out those 3 branches, and then you look at what happens as a result of you doing those actions, and that's how the story develops. I think in today's world, particularly with the type of kind of social narrative we have with games, one of the biggest challenges that I've found so far is not having many women working in games, and the stigmas around being a woman who plays games or who writes games. Now, I don't think that's a technical challenge, it's more of a socio-economic challenge. We get this keen sense that if you are a gamer, you are playing first-person shooters or games where there are big armies and campaigns and it's to do with fighting. There aren't many games out there. There aren't many mainstream games that are just focused on the telling of small stories and the telling of, say, romance stories. So, for example, Regency love is something that a lot of people initially, when they hear about, they find a bit strange because they think, this teenage gamer loves playing Animal Crossing, but they don't particularly like school, like English essays, and they don't like Jane Austen, so why would they play this game? So I think a lot of these preformed kind of, I suppose, those stereotypes need to be challenged for us to fully embrace game writing, game development, and game creation for women, because women can play all sorts of games and they can write all sorts of games. I might want to slay a dragon one night and try to slay a gentleman with my eyes the other night. It can be up to you. And I think the biggest challenge, of course, is, as I've said, it's not a technical one. One way to overcome this challenge is for other women in game development to speak up and to do more things like this, which I think is great. It's great of the Inner West Council to be hosting this series, but also for the larger companies to be hiring more women writers and women game writers and story creators, for women who are interested, or young ladies who are interested in writing games, to go out and do their own thing. I think you'll probably find a lot of games written by women and created by women are indie productions, where just for example in our case, I sat down in a tiny apartment with 2 of my good friends during university, and we just dreamed up this game, and we sat down and we made it. I think it's really important for a lot of women to go and do that rather than be intimidated by what's out there. Just go and try to change the narrative, one story at a time. As I've said earlier, the game form contains a type of interactivity that you won't get in a lot of other medium. So I'm talking not just about prose fiction, but television, film, comic books. A lot of them, they tell great stories, but they don't have that level of interactivity. Those production companies, they can't write an infinite number of variables and then because they have to go and film those variables. So it's a lot more difficult for television to give you that, to give you all those story options. But for games, you just need a line of code and then a line of dialogue, and then you can go and generate all these different possibilities in the game world. And that's what I find so fascinating. That's what I love about writing for games, because I don't just sit there with the start of the narrative and then the conclusion. Okay, I don't just go start to end. Okay, I get to go do all the loopy-whoopy, timey-wimey things, and sometimes I get to the end. But you know what? With game writing, there's not just one ending. You can have hundreds of endings. You can have all these variables throughout the story, where you might go and one day you decide to take a walk through the woods rather than through the main road through town, and because you went through the woods, you ended up befriending a little birdie in the woods, and that bird becomes one of your lifetime companions. And all these tiny things can contribute to the ending of a game that makes it feel so personal for you. It's not that, when it comes to games, it really is not about the writer, right? Think about, a novel. You start and then you get to the end and you think, why, insert writer of choosing. Why did you do this to the characters? Why did I have to see this person suffer? My favorite character, I shipped these other two characters. Why in this love triangle did I not get my ship? And then you go off to AO3 and you write fanfic, which is great. Okay, I love fanfiction, by the way. Okay? But in game writing, you can actually give all those possibilities to the player, to the reader. And so they get to the end, and every single step of the way, they make a whole range of choices that ends up becoming them. So when you get to the end, the story is yours. You've essentially written a story, or you've played a story that someone has given you the backbones to which you can then act out your story, and that's what you get. So I love game writing. I think what's really important, especially if you are a budding or aspiring game writer, just find a story that speaks to you and then find a way to turn it into a game. I find it really helpful to just emulate other people. So, no one starts in a vacuum. Everyone throughout the history of the world has been stealing and borrowing and been inspired by others. If you think about any kind of literature that we find. So I specialised in Shakespeare studies, and Shakespeare was the greatest plagiarist of all time. Okay, he wrote fanfic and just turned his work into great plays. So I think it's important for you, rather than thinking about, rather than trying to find a story that works for a game, or trying to find a way to fit your idea of a game to a story, find a story that speaks to you. Think about a story that you want to tell, and then look at other people who have written for games, and look at other games that currently exist, and try to emulate their style. You might want to even contact some of the developers. So I think a lot of, one of the great things about these days is you have a lot of indie games writers and developers. So you can find them on Twitter, you can find them online, send them a tweet, maybe ask to send them a DM, and see if they're willing to help you out a bit. Play a lot of games, and then from that you'll develop your own idea of what kinds of gameplay speaks to you, and then from that use your own passions and your own creativity to write your own games. So I'm fortunate enough to be working with two other wonderful ladies in T43 Studios, and we sit down and have brainstorming sessions before we start any proper development for our games. So essentially what we've done in the past is adopt a character. So we all have a few characters or a few of the main characters that we really enjoy. So we all adopt a character and then we do a whole bunch of brainstorming based on those characters. We might say, oh, here's this person's tragic past, here's this person's happy-go-lucky upbringing, here's a list of this character's favorite cakes, so on and so forth. So we sit down and do the brainstorming together. We go off and do it by ourselves, and then we come back together and we look at what kinds of stories will then fit those characters. So with plot and character, so this is a highly contested part of narrative writing. I think I'd say that there are two types of, two camps that people fall under. Either they would prioritize plot or prioritize character, right? So those who prioritize plot would say, okay, doesn't matter what the characters are, what matters is these events happen, and then you can slot characters into these events and then things will happen. Then we also have, on the other hand, a very character-based approach, in which case, if you know everything that there is about a particular character, you can put them in any situation and you can find out what will happen as a result. Okay? And so any of the plot will be dependent on the characters. So I am of the latter. I believe in characters first. And I think that particular parts of plot will happen to particular characters that won't happen to other characters. So once we've developed these characters and we have a very solid sense of our game characters, we then go and see what kinds of mischief that they'll get to. So if we have, we've got, for example, in Regency Love, we have one character who loves books. So his name is Mr. Curtis. He loves books, but he's also quite judgmental of others and a bit antisocial at times. So because he's that kind of person, we can put him in all these situations where he's just very grumpy and he is standing there by himself, at a bore, and he won't talk to anyone, he won't talk to you, he won't respond to you positively unless you start talking to him about books. And then he gets really excited and he might go and show you his library and then lend you books and give you books as presents. Okay? So all of that is very much based on the characters, so characters and plot. Now, setting is another, so setting and world building, they go in hand. So with the setting, it is really important to have a think about I suppose the laws that govern a particular setting. So because I've been working extensively in the Regency era, it's important to understand what kinds of social etiquette is expected, what kinds of unspoken rules there are. You can't just be a lady, for example, and then walk around in trousers. That would be not good at all, unless perhaps if you're in London and you decide to to dress up as a boy completely, have the wig, bind your chest, okay, wear the trousers and the three-piece suit with the cravat, okay, pretend to be a gentleman, then maybe you'll get away with it. Okay? So find a setting that works for you. Now this doesn't have to be a historical setting. It can be just it could be the early 21st century. If you want to set a story, maybe it could be a COVID-19 love story. That would be, I would like to see a game that's made during COVID-19, about COVID-19, but about the positive parts of COVID-19 and how it helps people develop relationships. So if that's the setting, then you've got to think about what you're allowed to do and what you can't do, so on and so forth. Fantasy settings, fantasy and sci-fi. Now, for those who know me, I gripe a lot about fantasy settings that don't have good rules. Okay? I think it is very wrong for you to go in and say, okay, this is a fantasy setting. Because it's fantasy, anything goes. Right? I think the best fantasy novels and series are ones where you have, anything goes, but up to a particular limit. And you should actually have more rules governing those worlds than in our world today. If you introduce things like magic and, for sci-fi, if you introduce a lot of technology, make sure you understand in your own in your own mind how the magic works. So you need lots of rules, and make sure that you have good reasons for certain aspects of the world. Don't just chuck something in for the sake of it. Or if there's something you want to chuck in, you might think, okay, I really want to live in a world where it is mandatory for everyone to have cake 3 times a day. I love cake, so I would love this kind of world, okay? So if that's the case, you have to ask yourselves, now why is it mandated? Is there something going on? Is there a new scientific fact saying that, consuming sugar, excessive amounts of sugar will ward off diseases? Is there a new disease in town? Okay, post-COVID-19, we might think about all sorts of other diseases, and only sugar is the cure. Well, if that's the case, sure, everyone needs to have 3 servings of cake every day, for each of the meals. And then if that's the case, you might have one particular rebellious character who does not like cake, and they don't want to eat cake. What then happens to them? So, I know I'm coming up with some really silly examples here, but the point here is that no matter what elements of the world you're coming up with, no matter what setting you're using, make sure that there are rules, that you understand the rules and that you adhere to the rules, because then, and feeding back to plot and character, because then the rules will help guide what kind of character you are, what characters you're writing, and what kind of plots are allowed to happen because of the interaction between these characters and the worlds that they live in. Oh, favourite character. See, I am very, very partial to Mr. Curtis, the aforementioned gentleman, grumpy gentleman who loves books. But I also very much love a character called Mr. Graham. So in our expansion pack, we have Mr. Graham and then his best friend, Lord Sutton. So actually, this fella on the cover here is Lord Sutton. And they have a great friendship. So they have this bromance that's so epic that sometimes I want to write fanfic on my own stories, because a lot of what I want to write isn't necessarily in line with the company's vision, so my games development group. So I want to go in and write a whole bunch of stories about their romance. So I do love Mr. Graham, he's basically a little puppy, and then Lord Sutton, he's broody but really soft and squishy on the inside, and they just have a great friendship. We're actually going to explore their relationship further in the sequel, Regency Love London. So for Regency Love, we actually used my developers, so my programmer actually came up with her own little program for it, and it's very complicated and I don't know how she uses it, and I don't know how she came up with it. She's a bit of a programming genius. But for those who are interested in just getting started and just playing around with these interactive stories, there's a really great tool by a group, so another indie group called Inkle, that's I-N-K-L-E. So Inkle is they started as a duo based in Cambridge in the UK, and I had the great fortune of having coffee with them. They're really great, lovely gentlemen, and they've created this software called Ink. So Ink is a kind of an interactive storytelling software. You can download it onto your computer and write that way, or you can actually put some stuff through the Ink website and see some of the plots and the interactive text working out that way. Ink is really great because it's very user-friendly. It's meant to be for writers who don't really have that background in programming. Okay, so you might find it, just a really easy way to get into game writing without having to know about the programming and the coding to start off with. And Ink comes with some great documentation. So it actually tells you how to use the program. It's very powerful, and actually we're using it at the moment. So I'm starting to play with it for Regency Love London. We're not sure yet if we are going to stick with it, but I'm just playing with it. And I think our programmer is probably going to do stuff with both the ink and some of her own program, just to, I mean, it's all a bit over my head sometimes. Okay, but I would very much recommend you check it out and have a bit of a fiddle. So Regency Love, as I mentioned, is a game that I made with my group T43 Studios. So Regency Love itself was first released in 2013. It was actually released on Jane Austen's birthday, the 16th of December, because, way to be corny. So Regency Love was released then, and a couple of years later, so I think 2 years later, in May 2015, we released an in-app purchase that was kind of a DLC, or just an extra story pack featuring one main character you could romance called Mr. Graham, and in that pack you actually get to meet this wonderful guy called Lord Sutton. Now, something happens in that plot. I'm not going to spoil it in case you want to play it, but something happened in that plot, and a lot of our fans were really interested in Lord Sutton. They wanted to find out more about Lord Sutton, and they wanted more development with Lord Sutton. And so we got a lot of fan requests for Lord Sutton at that time. So in 2015, my group and I decided to go on a bit of a hiatus. So we decided to write a spin-off novel. So the great thing about writing a novel is that I didn't have to work with Melody, our programmer, and Jenny, our artist, every step of the way, because it wasn't as cooperative as writing, well, as Regency Love. I wrote Lady Lavender. There were many drafts, and it was a very slow progress because it was just, I was just doing it in my free time for funsies. And once that was done, we launched a Kickstarter campaign, and we had hundreds of our wonderful fans who supported us, and they made this happen. So Lady Lavender is a spin-off novel, and now it's not being commercially published, it's independently published. And it's not out there in mainstream libraries or whatnot, although I'm hoping that you might be able to get a copy from NOS Library. So a lot of people who have enjoyed Regency Love and who wanted to know more about the characters could go and read Lady Lavender. But we've also had some people who just read Lady Lavender as a standalone, and they really enjoyed the characters. So we have had quite a few fans who actually came to Regency Love through Lady Lavender. So that's also really great fun, because you get to see how a lot of our players, they start with I suppose the sequel of sorts, and then they go back and discover the origin stories of certain characters, and it's always really great fun to see that. So Lady Lavender is available at NOS Libraries, and you can borrow your copy. Thank you so much for watching this. It's been lovely chatting with you, and it's been lovely to have your e-company today. You can find me on Twitter if you have any questions that you'd like to ask after watching this video. So on Twitter, I am at Samantha Lin. I am occasionally on Twitter. I'm on Instagram as well, at SXYLIN. Sounds a bit weird, but I swear those are actually my initials. I'm Samantha Xingyin Lin. I know it's one of the reasons I got my PhD, actually, is so that I could get official mail addressed to Dr Samantha Lin, so that you can find me on Instagram. And I look forward to seeing you in the future for one of the workshops.